Delighted today to welcome Dr. Mahar Hussain Aziz. Mahar is Professor at New York University on the International Relations Master's course. She is an acclaimed author, having written The Future World Order, which we're going to have a new edition of that arriving very soon, soon to be followed by Global Spring. She's also a risk advisor for the World Economic Forum's Global Futures Council. And amidst all that is also a cartoonist. And I believe has a cartoon book coming out about rationalization, AI, extremism, and the like. So a lady of very many knowledge areas, and we're delighted to have you with us today. So enjoy, and Mahar, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that intro. Yes, so happy to be back. In fact, I did my PhD at the LSE many years ago before I moved to NYU. And I also lived here in the 1990s. I went to Francis Holland Girls' School. Anybody heard of it? Yeah. So it's always great to be back. And I have some other work here, so I'm so glad it worked out in person. Yes, why don't we kick off with the first slide? You've kind of already heard who I am and what I do. Of course, you'll note a lot of my slides have images. I didn't draw some of them. Some of them are from generative AI. I thought, why not? But yes, I'm a global citizen with Pakistani Muslim roots. I grew up in 7 countries, and so I suppose it was inevitable that I would grow up to, study global affairs. And my career path has led to a focus on global risk and future trends, which is what I'll talk about with you today. But I do have a portfolio career. So NYU is definitely my home base, my professional home base, where I teach and lead a research project, a couple of them. But the most notable one, which I'll talk about, is predicting what's next, predicting the next major risks, the next shock events, the less obvious risks. So that's sort of my focal point. I also teach an online course of my specialty to diplomats, but also to high schoolers around the world. If you can believe it, the high school students sometimes come up with more enlightening views than some of the older crowd. But yes, and as was mentioned by Karen, I do advise the World Economic Forum. I've been on the Global Future Council on Risk for the last 5 years or so. You should certainly check out the Global Risk Report, which I also contributed to. They named conflict as the major risk for 2025, which is fair. I also recently became the co-chair of policy at think tank, the Digital Economist, and we are producing an AI policy brief series. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about AI, most recently now with DeepSeek. I don't know if anyone's tried it. There's also a third option. Alibaba apparently has another search engine, chatbot that we can potentially use. So we'll see how that plays out and how Trump's team reacts to this after their Stargate announcement, $500 billion US investment. And I believe DeepSeek is more sustainable, cheaper. So anyway, we'll see how that plays out. So we're working on that. And I do advise, in fact, tomorrow I'll be speaking to some executives. But yeah, it's enlightened advisory. So we work with C-suite and give them judgments on what's next. Everybody obviously is curious, particularly as we've kicked off the year with Trump 2.0. Yeah. So we'll talk about that as well. And yeah, these are the books. This is the original comic, The Global Kid. It has VR, AR elements. If any of you have kids, or if you are a kid at heart, I would encourage you to reach out to me. I'll get you a copy. And these are the 3 books. Future World Order, the 2025 edition is coming out. I had hoped to share it with you today, but we had a bit of a glitch. So we're going to get you copies for those who are here. And these are the other 2 sequels. It's a trilogy to explain the world order. And I do feel strongly that more women, more diverse perspectives need to be out there about what's happening. It shouldn't be so US-centric. And obviously I'm based in New York. And I think it's more important than ever for more conversations on this. I will concede that there are people who critique the work that we do. As the quote says, human beings who spend their lives studying the state of the world are poorer forecasters than dart-throwing monkeys. I usually say if you can prove that, you get a free book, but you're getting a free book anyway. So we can put that aside. So certainly take it with a pinch of salt if somebody tells you this is how it's playing out and don't believe anybody else. I'm not suggesting that to you. I'm going to offer you a perspective. And I feel it is going to add value to your understanding of the world, but certain things cannot be predicted, right? The pandemic, for instance. So just something to keep in mind. Why don't we move on to the next slide? So the first thing I want to say is that you might make the assumption that the world has just become so unpredictable now because Trump has returned. But actually, the truth is it has been unpredictable for many years. And what I think we don't fully appreciate in terms of the public debate and even smaller conversations is that the post-Cold War era driven by the US hegemon has been challenged for perhaps 15 years, 20 years, it depends who you talk to. And I think it should be understood more in the context of a global legitimacy crisis. What do I mean by that? I mean that in 4 key ways, certain norms or characteristics of the post-Cold War era have been overturned. The first obvious one is that we were told at the end of the Cold War that the US is the sole superpower. And it made sense, given it had the legitimacy to say that. It beat the Soviet Union at the time, and it had the political capital to guide the world. The truth is that has been a challenge for a while. And the question is, if it's not a US-led world order, particularly now with Trump and his anti-globalist position, then what is it? What is how should we understand the international system today? So that's the first challenge that keeps coming up and explains a lot of the uncertainty that we've experienced, again, I would say since the Arab Spring, which was a while ago. Second, again, post-Cold War, we were told that democracy is the best system. All countries should follow democracy, and that is the sole surviving source of political legitimacy. Again, it made sense because the democratic US beat the communist system in terms of Soviet Union at the time, and that was a key marker of US foreign policy, promoting democracy around the world. A lot has changed, as we'll discuss. There are many studies that show that young people, Gen Z, but also older people, millennials, don't care as much about democracy. They would be okay with dictatorship. So we'll talk about that. Third, another aspect of global risk that we're dealing with and that's been building for a while is globalization. Again, post-Cold War, there was a Western-driven, US-driven globalization that was promoted. It isn't working. It has not led to opportunity in the way that we expected, and it certainly led to a strong policy alternative with populism. And lastly, society. And I think, unfortunately, this is the aspect of global risk, rather, that tends to be ignored. We're aware of it, but nobody is actually trying to fix it, and that has to do with our identity crisis. Post-Cold War, we were told that we should all get along, right? It made sense that we're globalists, and unfortunately, it hasn't worked that way. Do we still care about the other, the migrant, the refugee? And it's led to a dangerous strain of hate, which unfortunately we've experienced in every part of the world. So we'll talk about that as well. But again, much of what we've seen in over 15 years, the challenges we've seen, the risks that have bubbled up, the threats to stability, are because of the decline of the post-Cold War era, the challenge to that perceived status quo. So what we're dealing with now with Trump, we can go to the next slide, is actually not that surprising. I'm sure everyone loves to see this image of him. This is the way he communicates. And I don't know if you saw this meme that went around. My students got a kick out of it because he was in the debates. President Trump talked about how migrants were literally eating dogs and cats. And I still can't, and this was going around as a joke, but I still can't believe that the President of the United States is somebody who said that. It's quite shocking. I was telling Karen, I did become a US citizen not too long ago, and I did vote. I didn't vote for him. I still can't believe that this happened the way it did. But we obviously have to appreciate what this means. What does Trump 2.0 mean for our geopolitics? One can assume that the democracy promotion policy of the U.S. government is pretty much over. I'm sure you've already heard that U.S. aid has been cut or suspended for the moment. And I think he's pretty clear that he's going to follow through on his campaign promises. What are we going to see big picture in geopolitics? I think a return to this autocratic bromance that he had the first time around. We will probably see that. I would imagine down the road we're going to see renewed discussion about how this is a post-U.S. leadership era, that the U.S. is no longer indispensable in international affairs. And so let's see how it plays out. I think in terms of the silver lining of Trump, he has shown a commitment to ending the Ukraine war. I think that's positive. I think he probably is going to have more traction than Kamala Harris would have. But obviously, a lot really hinges on his mood. We just have to keep track day to day. It's a lot harder to make judgments. I think the other silver lining to remember with Trump returning is that we're going to see other actors empowered, whether it's the global south or other superpowers or smaller states. And I think that is important to recognize. The nature of power is going to evolve away from U.S. leadership because Trump is again going to declare he's not responsible for the world. So there is a silver lining there. In terms of Trump's effect on U.S. politics, there is, again, renewed discussion, as was the case during his first term, that democracy is dying. I don't think democracy is dying necessarily in the U.S., but I think certainly we're going to see the institutions, to what extent they can hold him accountable. Are we heading further down the road? Are we heading towards a post-democracy world where countries do not feel the pressure to be democratic? I think that'll be an interesting trend to keep mindful of. In terms of economy, obviously he's already shown that his favorite word and favorite tool in economic policy is tariffs. He's already put pressure on countries like Denmark to give up Greenland and is threatening tariffs. He's already managed to successfully use this strategy with countries like Colombia, as I'm sure you've heard, to get his way. So I think resurgent populism and the rise of economic war is a trend that we'll have to contend with, certainly in the coming year. We'll see how it plays out. Does he back down? Because I think most economists have said fairly openly that this strategy of his will lead to greater inflation for everybody. I'm sure perhaps you saw his address to the World Economic Forum at Davos, where he said, "Hey, if you want to deal with the U.S., you want to sell your products here, that's fine, but make them in the U.S., otherwise we will impose tariffs." He warned everybody. So it's not just Canada, Mexico, China that are his targets. So this is definitely going to be an era of renewed economic war, with tariffs in particular being his main sort of weapon. I know I sound very negative. I'll get to the positive, but will we see globalization become more resilient as it deals with the shocks coming from President Trump's economic policy? I think that could be a silver lining. I think we will see renewed focus, as we already saw during the Biden era, on the BRICS and their desire to create a new currency. I think to what extent that will be positive for the global economy is a separate issue. Again, Trump has already threatened in one of his tweets that any country that moves away from the US dollar in trade will be punished. So we'll see how this plays out. But I think resurgent focus on other currencies, central bank digital currencies, and perhaps even a move away from World Bank, IMF, and for other types of, there's been renewed talk about the Asian Monetary Fund. So other sources of funding, I think, could be a result of Trump and his return. Is it positive for the world? I don't know. I think we have to wait and see, but something to keep in mind. And lastly, with Trump, as you can imagine, there is a sense of that it's okay to be racist, that it's okay to be hateful. That was the sense during his first term, where we saw Islamophobia and other types of hate. I think the expectation is that will recur. What I do remember during the first Trump era is that there was a powerful civil society response. You saw more people standing up for positive American values. And I think that will likely happen again, although obviously the U.S. is currently so focused on things like the LA fires and so forth. But let's see how this plays out. It's only week one. We've only had 1 week of Trump. So a lot could change. He could have a change of heart, but, I think he's already been pretty clear about other policies that will likely lead to significant unrest within the US and trigger protests around the world, reproductive rights, for instance. So that's something to keep in mind. So that's the Trump slide. Let's move on. Okay, so if we're thinking about the world ahead in the coming year and the coming 4 years, we can't ignore these three factors: AI, climate, and war. Okay, I should mention that most studies have shown that, unsurprisingly, that conflict has, well, for instance, the ACLED has said that conflict has doubled in the last 5 years. Not surprising. And as I mentioned earlier, WEF in our global risk report highlighted state-based violence and conflict as the number one risk for 2025. Nothing is surprising about that. We have major wars on multiple continents. This is perhaps the most dangerous decade that we are experiencing. And we've already been through a pandemic and now Trump's return, so not ideal. I think what we're going to see and what we've already started to see is that other types of actors are going to step up. Where Trump is not interested, you will see other actors try to engage in policy with regards to conflict resolution. That is positive. It should be known that countries like China, who is, of course, a big power, and from my perspective anyway, has shown it has wanted to be the number one global power. I do get pushback on saying that. I said this at the Paris Peace Forum. I had a busy speaking schedule in the fall, and I was at the Paris Peace Forum and raised this as an issue, and was challenged that no, that China actually doesn't want to be the lead power. Perhaps Chinese leadership has realized they don't have to try so hard to knock the US down because Trump might do it on his own. But something to recognize is that China has shown a desire to be relevant in diplomacy, coming up with a peace plan for Ukraine. Obviously, it didn't work out, but the fact that it started that process of its foreign policy is significant. It did negotiate a détente between longtime rivals, Saudi Arabia and Iran. This was over a year ago. And I think that's something, let's face it, the US would never have been able to do, given its position on Iran. So yes, there's more war in the world, but because of the Trump factor, we might see that other countries realize they can play a bigger role in diplomacy and ending conflict. I think that's significant. So just something to keep in mind. In terms of the AI effect, obviously at the moment we're just thinking about the battle of ChatGPT versus DeepSeek and Alibaba's platform as well. We'll see how that plays out. There's no question that AI is a significant marker of power, and countries have realized that. In terms of the geopolitical aspect of AI, well, is AI the new superpower? That is an idea that has been put forth by people like Ian Bremmer, who you've probably heard of. He's the head of the Eurasia Group. Is the next superpower not US, not China, but AI itself? I don't know if I buy that argument at this stage, but there's no question that AI is a significant marker of power and war. Many countries are focused on AI weaponry. Many technologists are saying we better ban this because it could lead to World War III. So something to keep in mind. And of course, the other bleak scenario is that AI leads to the next pandemic. That's been warned by a group of scientists. They've been published in various outlets saying that actually AI could lead to pathogen-capable, pathogens that are going to lead to the next pandemic. So it's something to keep in mind. There's so much effort on regulation, and yet, like with everything else, it may not be enough. I know the EU has made a lot of progress with the AI Act. I was at the UN, the Summit of the Future in September when we signed the Pact for the Future that also has a global digital compact. But again, enforcing these issues as AI rapidly accelerates, it's not so straightforward. So I think we're going to have challenges there. In terms of politics, last year, as you know, was the year of elections, right? Almost half the world participated in the elections. And we were really concerned at the start of 2024 that AI would derail a lot of these results because of misinformation, disinformation. It did happen. It did happen in some contexts. And even some politicians used AI Here in the UK, there was a candidate who created a chatbot. I'm forgetting, was it AI? I'm forgetting his name, but a chatbot to connect with more constituents. And he said, whatever people say to the chatbot is what I will use in my platform. That's been used in other countries as well. He didn't win, but the point is, could we down the road see more aggressive use of AI by politicians in their campaigns and in their policy making? But I think in terms of AI misinformation, I'm not sure that we have a real, again, unless there's aggressive regulation that actually can be enforced, I think we should expect that this will continue. In terms of the economy, obviously, we'll talk about this, but I think my greatest concern is the techlash. We know that jobs are going to be lost. I'm not sure our governments are fully prepared for that transition. It's great to hear these big statistics that by 2030, AI will add trillions to the global economy, but we also, and it's going to create jobs, but what do we do in that interim period? That's something that we're not paying sufficient attention to. So I would say that is a significant trend down the road. I think the bigger issue, let's say by 2030, we've all put all this funding towards AI. What if it turns out to be hype? What if AI does not deliver? There's concern that it could be, we could be misjudging it. And the Nobel Prize winning economist Darren Acemoglu actually talked about this recently, that according to his research, AI is not going to create as much growth as we anticipate. So will it lead to a downturn down the road? So it's something to keep in mind. In terms of a positive element of AI in the economy, can AI beat the market? I'm sure you know that Wall Street is desperately trying to see how they can make more money with AI. Can it beat the market? I don't know if that will happen, but there are others like Mustafa Suleyman, who wrote a great book on AI, The Coming Wave. He now heads up Microsoft's AI division. And he thinks that within the next 2 years, if you give AI $10,000 or whatever the amount is, it can come back to you within a certain amount of time and make you $1 million. Can AI beat the market that way? If that's possible, can we then use AI for good, beat the market and use that for global good to end poverty, reduce poverty at the very least? That would be my hope, but I don't think it'll happen. Anyway, lastly, AI, in terms of its effect on society, already we see that there are groups that are using it for negative outcomes. ISIS apparently has a chatbot that it uses to recruit people. We obviously have, I don't know how we stop that. Have we stopped social media from recruiting young people, radicalizing young people? No. It was just a couple of months ago that Taylor Swift concert in Austria, Vienna, Austria, where two young teenagers were radicalized online and planned to blow up the concert. Luckily, they were stopped in time. And now in the US, I'm sure you've heard, Meta, Facebook has announced that they will no longer be regulating content. So if you want to put hate online, they will not stop it. So I think there's definitely reason to be concerned. Social media, of course, but also AI, the effect of AI on the use of it by these negative actors. I don't have a solution for it. Again, the social aspect of our global problems keep getting swept under the rug. And I don't anticipate any of our leaders within this world of heightened global risk and shocks will prioritize this in the current era. So something to keep in mind. Yes, Trump 2.0 has an impact on our global challenges, the 4 challenges I mentioned earlier, but so do AI, climate, and war. Let's go to the next slide. So kind of touching on what I've already said, but just to go a little bit deeper, I want you to think about what is the structure of the world order today? Is it still unipolar? Again, is the US still the hegemonic superpower if it's not indispensable in every issue because Trump doesn't care about certain parts of the world or certain issues like climate change? Or is the world still bipolar, US versus China? Before the pandemic, I'm sure you recall, we were obsessively talking about how the 2020s would be defined by the competition between US and China. Is that still the case? I don't necessarily feel that is. Is the world more uni-multipolar? Is it about the US still being the big power, not a benign superpower, but still a big power, and obviously these other actors are stepping up? That is how we view it in the context of IR. This is how we construct, these are the constructs we use to understand the world better. I still feel this is insufficient. I think we have to acknowledge other types of actors. The BRICS, for instance, yes, they're a little bit unwieldy. I don't know if their association will stay united going forward, but the fact that there is this growing challenge to the West, especially US leadership, is significant. I think we cannot ignore the tech firm. I don't feel it's necessarily a superpower, as I mentioned earlier, but I think we can't ignore the power they have on geopolitics. Just an example, the Ukraine war was changed dramatically simply by the act of Elon Musk when he sent his Starlink internet to the country to help, facilitate their operations. Even Microsoft approached the Ukrainian government days before the invasion and said, let's move your data from your ministries to the cloud. So there's definitely a powerful role for these actors, and we're not holding them accountable. They're not part of government, but in a way, Elon Musk, somebody like him, is a sort of unofficial diplomat for the US government. So something to keep in mind. Don't ignore the activists. They have incredible power. Groups like Global Citizen, which I'm a huge fan of, lead these campaigns to put pressure on governments to do better, to raise more funding for Ukraine, for putting more money into vaccine development during COVID and so forth. Investors, let's not forget the power of the investor to drive change. There's so much concern about climate change now being on the back burner because of Trump. But the truth is you can't stop the private funding. Even John Kerry, who is formerly of government, the former US climate envoy, has said, don't worry about it. Trump cannot stop all of this private investment that's going towards climate tech investment. And he actually works for Tom Steyer, the billionaire's fund now, to specifically focus on climate investment. So there are agents of change that cannot be ignored. Don't just think about the world in the context of the superpower, and certainly not just in the context of the US. Next slide. So just kind of building on what I said, how should we think about power in geopolitics going forward? We can't ignore the US's transactional approach. Some issues will be of priority for President Trump and others will not. And as I already said, war, AI, climate, these are the major factors. But we have to realize that down the road, the nature of power is going to change. It's not just about the US promoting democracy. It's not about that at all. It will be about AI diplomacy, the countries that perhaps focus on investing in AI infrastructure in other parts of the world. That can be a significant marker of soft power. Climate diplomacy, countries that decide that they want to invest in adaptation, mitigation in other countries, because we recognize that the UN Loss and Damage Fund is almost pretty much a joke. And I did speak at COP29 in Baku a couple of months ago, and there's ongoing frustration about the value of these sorts of dialogues. And where will the change actually happen? I am encouraged by countries like Scotland. They donated, I think it was a couple of million to Malawi to deal with the effects of climate change privately, not part of the UN. And I think, so it'll be interesting to see what countries leverage climate diplomacy, AI diplomacy to help other countries deal with these issues and move forward. Obviously, we can't ignore the big powers, but we should also be mindful of the swing states. Jared Cohen of Goldman Sachs has talked about the rise of geopolitical swing states. For instance, countries that realize that they have incredible assets with their critical minerals that will be very relevant to the big powers going forward, as we hopefully move towards renewable energy and so forth. So something to keep in mind. And when I talk about private actors, I am referring to the billionaires of the world. I know that it's not, I've been saying this for over 10 years, that we have to be mindful of the role of billionaires and the fact that they are agents of change. Just to give you a more recent example, Michael Bloomberg, through his foundation, is going to be giving funding to the UN for climate because Trump has made it clear he's stopping that. So you do have private actors that are stepping up, using their private funding to affect change. And I think that could be a trend that will escalate going forward. Next slide. So by the way, so political risk focuses on democracy, as I mentioned earlier, in a post-Cold War era. I did type in stressed out politician on generative AI, and this is what came out. I didn't ask for Boris Johnson, but I'm pretty sure that looks like him, right? So anyway, what you need to be mindful of is, again, democracy is no longer working, okay? It doesn't matter whether you're from Pakistan or you're here in the UK or in part of Africa, Latin America. There's been frustration building about democracy for almost 20 years. This could be the 20th year of democratic decline if the trend continues as it has in the past, okay? This is according to Freedom House, EIU. A lot of data points are there. The fact that this crisis of democracy is in the Western context is significant. And as I said earlier, there's no desire, I would imagine, for Trump to promote democracy around the world. So who will defend democracy? Will it be the EU? Will it? I don't know. I don't know. But the bottom line is we've been experiencing a crisis of political legitimacy. Back in 2012, I wrote a piece for CNN on the rise of, well, it kicked off by saying, if you're a politician this year, you were probably slapped in the face, because there were so many instances of citizens slapping or throwing food at politicians, and so many examples around the world of anti-government sentiment that people are pushing back and saying this isn't working, that there must be a better way to govern. It's happened in non-democratic countries, it's happening in democratic countries, and that trend has continued. Citizens are angry everywhere in what feels like a global spring. And I'm not sure that we fully appreciate that we might be, again, moving into another phase of our political development that has to grow beyond democracy. Is there something better? In our work, we do talk about the role of technology, but the bottom line is in governance and how that could be a way forward. Bottom line is it's a hard time to be a world leader. Only 8% of the world's population lives in a full democracy. And again, anti-government unrest has been resurgent in many parts of the world. Next slide. What's next in our political development? As I said, we have to think about the role of other types of actors. It's no longer just about citizen and government. That relationship between citizen and government has severed, right, in many parts of the world. We have to recognize other agents of change, the billionaires, the techies, the activists, the nonprofits, to what extent they can be more prominent in bringing or repairing the social contract. I think that will be significant. As I said, there are tech tools that we've researched in our work. For a while, I was doing a lot of work on the role of crowdsourcing in policymaking. How can we make governance more inclusive? Countries like Iceland, for instance, tried to crowdsource their constitution a couple of years ago to get more input simply by using Facebook to get more input from citizens. Blockchain is another strategy that's been used. It's been tested out in certain countries to make governance more transparent. So that would be ideal if we could follow those strategies. But again, as I said, I feel personally, and this comes up in the next books, Global Spring, etc., that we are heading for a post-democracy world. When you have a U.S. government that's not likely going to be promoting democracy as a global goal, the way Biden attempted to do, and now Trump is not doing, we are likely heading into a post-democracy world. What is the next stage of our political development? So I would encourage you to think about that. I would imagine down the road, at the end of this decade, perhaps fewer of us are talking about democracy and more of us are talking about whether our government is dealing with the effects of AI, dealing with the effects of climate change. Let's see how things develop. But again, there are multiple studies that show that young people, Gen Z, millennials, and are not really focused on democracy. It's not a priority for them. So something to keep in mind. Next slide. So I mean, this is fairly obvious. We've had a lot of uncertainty that bleeds into threats to the global economy. Right now, there's renewed focus on economic nationalism because of President Trump and his strategies. Is history repeating itself? Because actually, this trend we've seen of resurgent economic nationalism is what we saw in the years leading up to the First World War. Is this history repeating itself? As I mentioned earlier, Trump's economic weapon of tariffs are clearly going to be with us for the next couple of months. Let's see. But the short-term and longer-term impact are expected, according to economists, are expected to be inflation. Other global economic risks that have come up for the last couple of years are ongoing debt crisis. I already mentioned the AI hype. What about currency wars? I touched on that, the fact that the US dollar could be replaced in trade. That is the agenda of, or at least the reduced dependence on US dollar in trade. That is the agenda of the BRICS, and some countries, India, UAE, etc., are already doing more trade in their own currency. So how will that impact the global economy? How will that impact the US dollar? Something we need to keep track of. And yeah, so that, I think we've already covered this, so let's go on. But what I feel is the greatest economic risk, and we're not talking about it enough, is the occupational identity crisis that sadly many of us are going to have to go through when we are told that we are being replaced by robots. By the way, this I did create this. This is from my comic book. It's not generative AI. So it's just showing that in the future we'll be going for job interviews but keep competing with robots. But the basic idea or the basic thesis we need to remember is that we've been told for a while, pre-pandemic, we were told automation was going to replace a lot of jobs, for instance, in the food industry, the retail industry. But now it can also impact other industries, the law and education and so forth. 50% of jobs could be replaced by AI by 2027. That's 2 years away. That's according to Kai-Fu Lee. In fact, he recently reiterated this prediction as being uncannily accurate. Are our governments prepared for that period when we are not sure where we fit in a tech-driven, AI-driven economy? And the jobs that the new jobs that are being created, we may not necessarily have the skills for that. Something to keep in mind. IMF has talked about this as well. They didn't give a specific timeline, but 60% of jobs may be impacted by AI. Emerging markets, low-income countries will have less exposure to that, although the AI Government Readiness Index that recently came out did show that low-income nations, middle-income nations are reorienting their strategies so that they do have a focus on AI. So something to keep in mind. The Inter-American Development Bank has dug deeper into this because there's so much discussion, but occupational exposure, as it says, average job replacement, 28% in a year, 38% in 5 years, 44% in 10 years. That's a lot of disruption due to AI. Are we prepared? What I feel and what we've already seen is that the precariat class, which is a concept coined by Guy Standing at SOAS, where I used to teach many years ago during my PhD days, he says that there's this growing precariat class that feels left behind. They felt left behind by globalization. They felt left behind during the global youth unemployment crisis of, for instance, of the 2010s. Perhaps they felt left behind by the pandemic. Many economic policies during the pandemic did not allow for people to make it through. And now they potentially could be left behind due to AI and AI-related unemployment. So the idea is that this precariat class has no occupational identity. They jump from one temporary job to another, and it does bleed into a mental health crisis. We do not talk about this issue enough. I don't think our governments are prepared. In the US context, there was one presidential candidate a few years ago, Andrew Yang, who you may have heard about, who wrote a book on this, that automation is going to take away jobs, we better prepare. He did suggest UBI, Universal Basic Income, as a strategy, that government should have an additional cushion for people who lose their jobs to automation. He pitched it to government. They said, okay, great idea, but we don't have the money. Find the money for this. So I don't think this will necessarily, UBI is not necessarily the solution. There have been some pilot projects done in, I think, in certain Scandinavian countries and also in a couple of cities in California. But is this going to be a strategy that we need when we have that gap? Losing the job, one's job to automation, AI, and then that period where we're not yet upskilled for the new jobs. And again, that psychological component, not everyone who loses their job will want to work in AI or learn those new skills. Even me, I can have fun with generative AI, but if I were told that, hey, you need to change your strategy completely while you teach or while you consult or speak and use these tools, it is anxiety inducing. So I think it's something to keep in mind. So UBI has been proposed by a lot of the tech billionaires. They even suggested that let's tax AI firms and use that funding for support for people who lose their jobs to AI. There was also at a certain point, it'll never happen, but data for income swap. Social media companies should pay us for the data that we give them. Obviously, that's not happening. I think the biggest strategy is the focal point should be AI upskilling. The good news is tech firms have figured out that they need to, well, partly for their own PR, but partly because I think they're trying to do good, some of them, they have come together, Microsoft, Cisco, a couple of other companies, Google, and they've said, we're going to commit to upskilling, for instance, 2 million people in India this year. Okay, they're doing it in partnership with local government, local nonprofits, and so forth. That is positive. The fact that in the absence of political leadership on this issue, tech firms are showing leadership. I think that's positive. Is it going to be sufficient? I think, again, we're going to have people who fall through the cracks and become part of the precariat class around the world, unfortunately. It is a concern. And yeah, so we're going to see people frustrated. By the way, that's my dog, Lucky, who features in the comic book. He looks pretty sad about AI unemployment too. Next slide. Yeah, social risks. So we've covered geopolitics, politics, economy, threats to stability in those three categories. What about social risk? As we've already I'm sure you know, global hate is on the rise. Since September 11, obviously that was a long time ago, but Islamophobia became very prevalent. During Trump's first term, there was no question Islamophobia was on the rise in the US. The UN says hate is rising to alarming levels. During COVID, as you know, there was an East Asian backlash. Who is going to tackle these social sensitivities? I don't know. And obviously, certainly in the US and perhaps in this part of the world too, there's definitely been protests and unrest and sensitivity due to the Israel Gaza situation, and that's frankly ongoing. It's been on campuses as well, including at NYU. Students feeling very passionate about this issue and so forth. So I don't know where this will. I don't see a solution for this, and it's sad that hate has just in the last over a decade since I've been working, it's just escalated, right? And it's leading to this larger questions. If we're not globalists, are we globalists? Are we nationalists? Do we care about the other? That identity crisis, I think, is happening in a lot of countries. And the fact that this dialogue or this narrative is being put forth by certain leaders of countries or political parties is concerning. Next slide. And beyond hate, obviously hate is significant and is obviously being tools like AI, social media are going to continue to be used by these groups. We should also be concerned about extremism. When I started my career, we only really talked about Al-Qaeda because it was, after September 11, it was just about Islamist extremism. That was the biggest threat. However, we've seen resurgent examples of far-right extremism in parts of Europe, in the US. We've also seen the rise of Buddhist extremism. It sounds strange to say that, but in countries like Myanmar, in countries like Sri Lanka, there is a dangerous extremist contingent, Buddhist monks. In fact, there was a cover of Time magazine a couple of years ago and showing the Buddhist monk of Myanmar who was dubbed the Burmese bin Laden. His rhetoric on Muslims, the Muslims in his countries, sounded, very concerning and has led to this. In fact, the extremist monks in Sri Lanka and Myanmar formed an anti-Islamist pact. And the Rohingya Muslims and other Muslim minorities have currently been targeted. It's not a global problem, but it's definitely a significant example of how extremism has evolved, and also Hindu extremism, which unfortunately has been perpetuated by parts of the Indian government. And apparently that ideology has been exported to communities in parts of the US, parts of Europe. So something to keep in mind. Where are we headed? How do we stop extremism? Earlier in my career, I obsessively tried to come up with strategies to stop terrorism, especially Islamist extremism. I was a Business Week columnist for a while, and I wrote a series on how to stop Islamist extremism in countries like Pakistan after the Mumbai attacks. Remember that? How do we fight terror by creating jobs in the rural areas and so forth. I got a lot of angry feedback on that because everyone, there's a lot of sensitivity about this. But where are we headed going forward? I don't think we're going to stop at any of these other strains that already exist. I think it's inevitable that eco-terrorism makes a resurgent comeback if we continue on this trajectory where citizens are realizing our governments are failing at climate change, at tackling climate change. We could see that come up. I'm not suggesting teen activists are going to become extremists, but I think there's potential for this to bubble up. I also think that we might see a form of terrorism that focuses on anti-tech, people who feel angry they lost their jobs to automation, AI, etc., and they're targeting tech firms. I think it could lead to some sort of violent backlash. Unfortunately, refugees are already being exploited by terrorist groups. That does happen in parts of Africa. We've also seen climate refugees. For instance, in Pakistan, there were examples of after past floods, you did see that militant groups were approaching these individuals, giving them flood relief support because government was nowhere to be seen. And I would imagine that trend would continue. And like I said earlier, extremist groups using AI tools. How do we stop all of this? I'd love your answers if you have them, but something to keep in mind. How do we put an end to this? Next slide. So big picture, I've kind of talked about this already, but as I said, I lead, beyond teaching, I do research and I lead a couple of projects at NYU. The one we've done for 9 years that gets media coverage in Time magazine, it's also been in Newsweek, is where we predict what's coming in the next year. This year, we thought, let's be a little cheeky and look to 2030 as well. What could the major risks be, the major challenges? So these are the ones that have come up. Broader trends, power dispersing in a post-superpower era. I've kind of alluded to that already. Again, a chronic crisis of political legitimacy. Our governments are not delivering. What's the next phase of our political development? Mental health crisis. We wrote about this recently as well in World Economic Forum's agenda. The fact that our pandemic global mental health crisis isn't necessarily over. It's just being exacerbated by anxiety over AI, climate. And frankly, in this uncertain period, we're probably going to be more defined by an era of shock events. Every government is just going to be reacting to unexpected shock events as they escalate. And we had a couple of examples. This came out in 2023 of possible shocks. Trump returning to the presidency, that did happen. AI sparking a major war, that's inevitable. We also talked about US dollar being replaced in global trade. It's in play. I already mentioned eco-terrorism. Billionaire hacking the planet. Again, I think if our governments continue to blow it, not to be so blunt, but you're going to see private actors try to step up. Billionaires like George Soros have said they want to fund techniques like solar geoengineering to artificially cool the planet. It could work for a couple of months. It could work for a couple of years. We don't know. But we're getting to that point where we may need strategies to buy us some time. And there has been some research done by the EU and during Biden's era in the US government into this strategy. The problem is we won't know what the long-term side effects might be. But I think it's inevitable that you'll see a private actor get involved in this. We do have one startup in the US, Make Sunsets is the name of it, privately funded, and they're trying to engage in a very basic form of solar geoengineering, releasing balloons of sulfur dioxide, I believe. And anyway, so I think it's inevitable that a private actor tries to hack the planet with good intentions, but it might not have the best outcomes. For this year, we talked about US global leadership being over. I think that's fair to say. Are we going to start to see a polycentric world where more power is dispersed, political power, there's more than one political center. I think that's what we're going to see. Power is going to disperse. I already talked about democracy being in decline. This could be the 20th year. The problem is, will anyone care? I don't know if anyone will care if that does happen, if this is the 20th year. I think we talked about, I already highlighted these. Global economic war that's going to affect everybody thanks to Trump's tariffs and AI acceleration. will continue. The problem is the social risks are going to be swept under the rug. As I said, relating to mental health crises, relating to job loss due to AI. There's already evidence, as I mentioned, of AI chatbots being used by negative actors. Apparently, chatbots are also telling students that they should please die. I couldn't believe this. There was a 29-year-old grad student in the US. There was coverage about how he asked the Google chatbot about his homework, and the response was, "Go away, please die," something along those lines. There's also there are a couple other examples. Character.ai is another popular one that young people use. And there were some negative outcomes from that as well. So social risks will be significant. I think the last point I'll mention is to do with sustainability of AI. I think there has been discussion by tech firms. They're aware that they use too much water, for instance, too much energy. I think there's progress towards reducing that consumption. Samsung is experimenting with purified sewage water so that they don't waste water that we would, for instance, need to stop the LA fires. I think there is an ongoing dialogue about this, but in the next year, we're not going to have resolution. So more social risks due to AI. Next slide. I think final slide. So much negativity. I'm sorry to start off the day with such negativity, but I am coming from the US and God, Trump is on the mind. What I do feel strongly is that Trump 2.0 will ultimately be a gift to the world. I've kind of alluded to this throughout my talk, but it is more opportunity for more actors in a post-Cold War era, where the US is not indispensable or caring about every issue, the US government. Other actors will stay up. Again, a more polycentric era is probably where we're headed. So something to keep in mind, more opportunity for other types of drivers of change. That is positive for all of us. And I think that's pretty much it. I know it's a lot. I'm sorry to burden you.
Thank you so much for the platter of anxiety-inducing content. I mean,
dear. I know.
Wonderful.
I'm so sorry. But there is opportunity. It's just going to take time. There is positivity. It will just take time. I think we should just deal with it this year. It's going to be a bumpy ride this year.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, I think for all of the the broad themes and the considerations, I think certainly where I found this helpful is the kind of interaction between the different themes that we sometimes see commentary on in isolation, as opposed to sort of seeing necessarily the link between them. I think one thing that's on the mind of some Western Europeans at the moment is Putin.
Yes.
And you haven't mentioned him at all. And I just wondered what your view was on how far Putin might go. And also how prepared you think Europe is for that.
I don't know how prepared Europe is, but I think on some level, this was inevitable, right? At some point, there was going to be a need to reimagine its relationship in terms of its security. I think depending on the US, now that we know the political system there can spit out somebody like President Trump, it would make sense for the EU to be more independent. I think what's also notable is that President Trump, I mean, look, he's been having a lot of press conferences about a lot of issues. I try to not look, but once you put him on TV, it's hard not to look away to hear what he has to say. But what was interesting is that he did initially say he wanted to end the Ukraine war within 24 hours of his rejoining the presidency. But that hasn't happened. But I think what's interesting is that he did note publicly that he said maybe China can help end this war and can negotiate with Russia. Because as you may be aware, days before the Ukraine war, Russia and China announced a partnership of no limits. They have a very special relationship. I'm sure it has evolved since then, but the fact that the US superpower is saying, maybe we can't fix this problem, maybe we should look to China to negotiate. They have a good bond, Chinese leadership and Putin. I think that is significant. Like I said, in terms of, I think it's time for Europe to look to its neighbor within this area and see how they can be empowered going forward rather than always looking to the US. And it's time for a shift. Trump 2.0 has given us that opportunity for the EU to be more empowered, like other countries as well.
We are out of time. Oh, but thank you, Mahar. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
You've given us lots of food.
I'm sorry to depress you.
Yeah. And for those of you who want a second instalment of this, Mahar's actually going to join us in June at the Performance Leaders Roundtable as well. So we'll be able to check you up on your predictions and the Global Risk Report. If we could just show our appreciation in the Norway.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much.